On the morning of February 3rd, 1879, Professor Marcus Silverpine walked into his classroom at Silverpine College in Ashtabula, Ohio, expecting to find 12 of his most promising students ready for their weekly philosophy seminar. Instead, he found 12 empty chairs, 12 unopened textbooks, and a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the very air from the room. What he discovered next would shake not only the small college bearing his family name, but expose a corruption so deep it reached into the highest echelons of Ohio's academic and political circles. But before we delve into the dark secrets that cost 12 young men their lives, I need to ask you to subscribe to Dark Heritage Files and hit that like button, because stories like this one require extensive research into historical records that most channels simply don't have access to. Also, I'm curious, from which city and country are you listening to this story? Leave a comment below and let me know. Your support helps us bring these forgotten mysteries to light. Now let me take you back to that winter of 1879, when the truth about Silverpine College was still buried beneath layers of respectability and academic prestige. According to the testimonies gathered by county investigators months later, along with personal letters found in the college archives, the events that unfolded that February night had been building for months, hidden behind the veneer of one of Ohio's most respected private institutions. Ashtabula, Ohio, in 1879, was a bustling port city on the shores of Lake Erie, where the railroad brought both commerce and opportunity to the growing industrial heartland of America. The city's location made it a natural hub for ambitious families seeking to educate their sons in preparation for careers in law, medicine, and public service. It was precisely this ambition that made Silverpine College so attractive to the wealthy families of Cleveland, Toledo, and even as far as Detroit. The college itself stood on a modest campus of 3 brick buildings surrounded by oak trees that had witnessed Ohio's transformation from wilderness to industrial power. Founded in 1847 by Professor Marcus Silverpine's father, the institution had built its reputation on rigorous academic standards and the promise that its graduates would be prepared for leadership roles in the rapidly expanding American economy. Professor Marcus Silverpine, then 34 years old, had inherited both the college and the weight of his family's educational legacy. A tall, meticulous man, with prematurely gray hair and intense brown eyes, he took pride in personally knowing each of his students. The philosophy and ethics courses he taught were considered among the most challenging at the college, attracting only the most serious and intellectually curious young men. The 12 students who disappeared that February night were no ordinary pupils. They were part of Silverpine's advanced seminar, a select group chosen for their exceptional academic performance and moral character. Among them were Jonathan Whitmore, son of a Cleveland steel magnate, Thomas Brennan, whose father served in the Ohio State Legislature, and Edward Morrison, destined for a career in law following his father's footsteps as a prominent Toledo attorney. These young men, ranging in age from 19 to 22, represented the future elite of Ohio society. They boarded at the college during the winter months, when Lake Erie's harsh weather made daily travel from their family homes impractical. The boarding arrangement created a tight-knit community within the college, where students formed deep friendships and engaged in lengthy discussions about philosophy, politics, and their future roles as leaders. The winter of 1879 had been particularly severe, with snow beginning in early December and continuing almost daily through January. The college's heating system, dependent on coal delivered by railroad, struggled to keep the buildings warm. Students often gathered in the library's main reading room, where a large fireplace provided both warmth and a comfortable space for evening study sessions. The evening of February 2nd, 1879, began like any other winter night at Silverpine College. Professor Silverpine had dismissed his advanced seminar at 6 o'clock, noting with satisfaction how engaged his students had been during their discussion of Aristotelian ethics. As the 12 young men filed out of the classroom, their voices echoed through the hallway, mixing serious academic discourse with the light-hearted banter typical of college students. According to the testimony of Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the college's head of domestic services, the students appeared in good spirits during dinner that evening. She specifically remembered Jonathan Whitmore asking for extra portions of beef stew, joking that the cold weather gave him an enormous appetite. Thomas Brennan had mentioned plans to write letters to his family, while Edward Morrison discussed his excitement about an upcoming debate competition. What Mrs. Hartwell found curious, however, was a conversation she overheard between Morrison and Whitmore as they left the dining hall. Morrison had whispered something about meeting tonight to discuss what we found, and Whitmore had responded with apparent nervousness, "Are you certain we should proceed? This could affect more than just us." The college's night watchman, Samuel Hutchinson, made his regular rounds at 9 o'clock, 10:30 and midnight. During his 9 o'clock inspection, he noted lights in several student rooms and the sound of quiet conversation from the second floor of the dormitory building. The 10:30 round revealed similar activity, though he observed that several students seemed to be moving about the building more than usual. It was during his midnight inspection that Hutchinson noticed something unusual. The library's main reading room, typically empty by 10 o'clock, showed a faint glow of lamplight from within. More troubling, he heard what sounded like urgent, hushed voices coming from inside. When he tested the door, he found it locked from the interior, something that violated college policy, as the library was never to be secured while students were inside. Hutchinson knocked gently and called out, "Students, the library closes at 10 o'clock. Please conclude your studies and return to your rooms." The voices inside immediately fell silent. After several minutes without response, he heard footsteps and the sound of the lock being turned. The door opened to reveal Edward Morrison, his face pale in the lamplight. "My apologies, Mr. Hutchinson," Morrison said, his voice steady, but his hands noticeably trembling. "We lost track of time during our study session. We'll retire immediately." As Morrison spoke, Hutchinson glimpsed the interior of the reading room and saw papers scattered across the large central table, along with what appeared to be several official-looking documents. The other 11 students stood behind Morrison, their faces shadowed, but their posture suggesting tension or anxiety. "Very well," Hutchinson replied, though something in their manner troubled him. "Please ensure all lamps are extinguished before you leave." The students filed out quietly, each nodding respectfully to the watchman as they passed. Hutchinson waited until they had all returned to the dormitory before completing his inspection of the library. He found the room properly secured and all lamps extinguished, though he noticed that the papers had been cleared from the table with unusual haste. Several chairs remained pushed away from the table at odd angles, and he detected a faint smell of burned paper near the fireplace. The next morning brought the discovery that would launch one of Ohio's most puzzling investigations. When Professor Silverpine arrived for his 8 o'clock class, he found not a single student present. Initially assuming they had overslept due to their late-night study session, he sent Mrs. Hartwell to the dormitory to wake them. Her scream echoed through the morning air when she discovered that all 12 rooms were empty, beds unslept in, and personal belongings undisturbed. It appeared as though the young men had simply vanished into the February night, leaving behind their clothes, books, money, and even their winter coats. The immediate response from both the college and the families of the missing students was swift and desperate. Professor Silverpine telegraphed the parents within hours of the discovery, while the Ashtabula County Sheriff organized search parties to comb the surrounding area. The harsh winter conditions initially led authorities to theorize that the students had somehow become lost in the snow, though this explanation satisfied no one who knew these young men's cautious nature. As word of the disappearance spread through Ashtabula and beyond, the story took on increasingly dramatic elements. Newspapers in Cleveland and Toledo reported that 12 of Ohio's finest young scholars had vanished without trace or explanation. The families, prominent in their respective communities, brought considerable pressure to bear on local authorities to expand the investigation. Within a week, private detectives hired by the families had joined the search, and the governor of Ohio had been personally contacted by 3 different families demanding state involvement. The mystery captured public imagination, partly because it seemed so inexplicable. How could 12 intelligent, responsible young men simply disappear from a secured college campus without leaving any indication of their intentions? The first significant development came 2 weeks after the disappearance, when a railroad worker discovered what appeared to be pages from a textbook frozen in the snow near the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railway tracks, approximately 2 miles from the college. The pages were identified as belonging to a philosophy text used in Professor Silverpine's advanced seminar, but they provided no clear indication of how they had come to be there. More puzzling discoveries followed over the subsequent weeks. A student's scarf was found hanging from a tree branch near the Ashtabula River, though the tree was located in the opposite direction from the railroad tracks. 2 witnesses reported seeing a group of young men walking toward the lake on the night of February 2nd, while another claimed to have observed several figures near the college's cold storage building at an unusually late hour. These scattered clues created more questions than answers, and as winter gave way to spring without any resolution, public interest began to shift from hope for the students' safe return to suspicion that something more sinister had occurred. The families, however, refused to accept that their sons might be dead, continuing to fund extensive searches and investigations throughout 1879. It was during this period of uncertainty that Professor Silverpine began his own private investigation into his student's disappearance. Unlike the official authorities, who focused primarily on physical evidence and witness accounts, Silverpine had intimate knowledge of his students' intellectual interests, personal concerns, and recent academic work. What he discovered would eventually lead him to a truth far more disturbing than any natural disaster or accident. The first clue emerged from Silverpine's careful review of his students' recent academic performance and behavior. In the weeks leading up to their disappearance, several of the young men had asked unusual questions about academic credentialing, the process by which colleges verified their graduates' qualifications, and the legal implications of educational fraud. Professor Silverpine's investigation took a decisive turn in late March 1879, when he decided to examine the library more thoroughly than the initial searches had allowed. As the founder's son and the college's senior faculty member, he possessed keys to areas that had been off-limits during the official investigation. What he discovered in the library's basement storage area would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hidden behind stacks of outdated textbooks and discarded furniture, Silverpine found a collection of documents that revealed the true scope of his student's final discovery. Carefully preserved in a wooden crate were dozens of certificates, diplomas, and official seals from not only Silverpine College, but from institutions across Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. The documents appeared to be templates and forgeries of varying quality. Some were crude attempts at replicating university seals and signatures, while others were so sophisticated they would have fooled even experienced educators. More disturbing were the ledgers that accompanied these materials, containing names, dates, and monetary amounts that suggested a systematic operation spanning several years. As Silverpine studied these records, a horrifying picture emerged. His own college, the institution bearing his family name and built on his father's commitment to educational excellence, had been systematically selling fraudulent credentials to wealthy families unwilling to subject their sons to rigorous academic training. The operation was sophisticated, involving not only forged diplomas but also fabricated academic records, false letters of recommendation, and coordinated deception across multiple institutions. The ledgers revealed that families had paid between $500 and $2,000, enormous sums in 1879, to purchase credentials that would allow their sons to enter professional careers without genuine qualifications. Even more troubling, the records indicated that this network had placed incompetent individuals in positions as physicians, lawyers, engineers, and government officials throughout the Great Lakes region. The scope of the operation became clear as Silverpine traced the connections revealed in the documents. The scheme involved corrupt administrators at multiple colleges, forgers skilled in replicating official documents, and a network of middlemen who facilitated transactions between families and the criminal enterprise. The financial record suggested that hundreds of thousands of dollars had changed hands over the course of several years. Most devastating for Professor Silverpine was the realization that his own signature had been forged on numerous documents. His reputation as an educator of uncompromising standards had been cynically exploited to give credibility to fraudulent credentials. The criminals had used his name and his father's legacy to legitimize their operation, turning the Silverpine family's commitment to education into a tool for corruption. As he studied the documents throughout the night, Silverpine began to understand what his students had discovered. The 12 young men in his advanced seminar, working on a research project about educational standards and professional qualification, had stumbled upon evidence of the forgery operation. Their questions about academic credentialing and educational fraud now made perfect sense. They had been trying to understand the implications of what they had found, but who else knew about their discovery? And more importantly, who had enough at stake to ensure that 12 promising young men would never have the opportunity to expose the truth? The answer to these questions came when Silverpine noticed something that had initially escaped his attention. Several of the forged documents in the collection bore dates from early 1879, suggesting that the operation was not merely historical, but actively ongoing. More chilling was his recognition of some of the names in the recent transaction records. They belonged to families he knew personally, including parents of students currently enrolled at the college. This discovery meant that his 12 missing students had not merely uncovered a past crime, but had threatened to expose an active criminal enterprise that was generating substantial profits for dangerous people. As the full implications of this realization settled upon him, Professor Silverpine understood that his students had not simply disappeared. They had been silenced by individuals who could not afford to have their crimes revealed. But before we continue with Professor Silverpine's investigation, I want to pause here to ask you something. If you're finding this story as disturbing as I am, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who appreciates real historical mysteries. The research that goes into uncovering these forgotten cases takes considerable time and effort, and your support makes it possible for us to continue bringing these stories to light. Now let's discover what Professor Silverpine found when he decided to confront the people responsible for his students' fate. Armed with the evidence he had discovered, Professor Silverpine faced a terrible dilemma. The documents clearly implicated several individuals in positions of authority at the college, including the Dean of Administration, Charles Weatherby, and the Registrar, Frederick Thornton. More troubling still, some of the recent transactions mentioned influential figures in Ashtabula's business and political community who had purchased credentials for their sons. Silverpine realized that simply presenting his evidence to local authorities might be ineffective or even dangerous. The sheriff, Judge Morrison, Edward Morrison's father, and several prominent businessmen were mentioned in the documents as either direct participants or beneficiaries of the fraud. The network of corruption was so extensive that he could not be certain whom to trust. After several sleepless nights considering his options, Silverpine decided to approach the problem methodically. He would gather additional evidence to strengthen his case, then contact authorities outside of Ashtabula who would have no personal stake in protecting the local corruption network. His plan required discretion and patience, but it offered the best chance of ensuring justice for his missing students. The first phase of his investigation focused on tracing the financial transactions documented in the ledgers. Using his connections within Ohio's academic community, Silverpine began quietly inquiring about graduates from various institutions who had entered professional careers without demonstrating expected competency levels. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears about the practical consequences of the fraud. In Cleveland, he learned of a physician whose medical practice had been quietly closed after several patient deaths due to fundamental errors in diagnosis and treatment. The man's medical degree, supposedly earned at a respected institution, could not be verified through normal channels. In Toledo, an engineer responsible for bridge construction had produced designs so flawed that his projects required complete reconstruction, though he possessed credentials suggesting expertise in structural engineering. These cases, and others like them, represented more than financial fraud. They demonstrated that the corruption network had endangered public safety by placing unqualified individuals in positions requiring genuine expertise. The 12 students who had discovered this operation had not merely threatened to expose financial crimes, but had possessed evidence of criminal activity that had already resulted in deaths and public endangerment. As Silverpine continued his investigation, he became aware that his activities had not gone unnoticed. Dean Weatherby began asking pointed questions about his research and his access to college records. Frederick Thornton, the registrar, started appearing in locations where Silverpine was conducting his inquiries, claiming coincidental business but clearly monitoring his activities. More ominously, Silverpine received an anonymous letter in early April warning him that curiosity about matters that don't concern you can lead to the same fate as your former students. The letter was brief and unsigned, but its implications were unmistakable. The people responsible for his student's disappearance were aware of his investigation and prepared to take similar action against him. Despite these threats, Silverpine persisted in gathering evidence. His breakthrough came when he discovered that the college's coal storage building, the same building where witnesses had reported seeing figures on the night of February the 2nd, contained more than fuel for heating. Hidden beneath piles of coal, he found the college's industrial furnace that had been secretly modified to burn at much higher temperatures than necessary for heating purposes. The furnace showed clear evidence of recent use beyond its normal heating function. Metallic residue around the firebox suggested that objects other than coal had been burned, and the unusually thick layer of ash in the bottom of the furnace contained fragments that Silverpine recognized with growing horror. Mixed among the coal ash were pieces of cloth, leather, and other materials consistent with personal belongings and clothing. As he sifted through the ash with a small garden trowel, Silverpine's worst fears were confirmed. He found the remains of a pocket watch that he recognized as belonging to Jonathan Whitmore, along with fragments of a fountain pen that Thomas Brennan had frequently used during class discussions. The evidence was undeniable. His 12 students had been murdered and their bodies destroyed in the college's own furnace. But who had committed this atrocity, and how had they managed to murder 12 strong, intelligent young men without any evidence of struggle or resistance? The answer to Professor Silverpine's questions came in the most unexpected way. On the evening of April 15, 1879, as he was preparing to contact federal authorities with his evidence, Silverpine received a visit from Dean Weatherby and Registrar Thornton. The two men arrived at his home just after dark, claiming they needed to discuss urgent college business. "Professor Silverpine," Dean Weatherby began, his usually composed demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. "We understand you've been conducting research into certain college matters. We believe it's time for a frank discussion about your findings." Silverpine, who had anticipated this confrontation, had already hidden copies of his evidence in secure locations. He invited the men into his study, where the conversation that followed would reveal the full scope of the crime that had cost 12 young lives. "Those boys discovered something they shouldn't have," Thornton said without preamble. "We tried to reason with them, to explain that their idealistic notions about academic integrity were naive in the real world. They refused to understand that our operation served a valuable purpose. It allowed deserving families to secure their sons' futures without subjecting them to unnecessarily rigorous academic requirements." Weatherby nodded agreement, adding, "The families who utilized our services were not seeking to harm anyone. They simply wanted to ensure their sons could enter professional careers without the delays and difficulties of traditional education. We provided a service that benefited everyone involved. Everyone except the patients who died under the care of unqualified physicians," Silverpine replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Everyone except the people who trusted engineers and lawyers who had never actually learned their professions." The two men exchanged glances before Weatherby continued. "The boys wouldn't listen to reason. They threatened to expose the entire operation, to destroy the livelihoods of dozens of families and the reputations of respected institutions. We had no choice but to prevent them from carrying out their threat. You murdered 12 innocent young men," Silverpine stated flatly. "We arranged for them to have an accident," Thornton corrected. "On the night of February the 2nd, we invited them to discuss their concerns about the documents they had found. We suggested they accompany us to examine additional evidence stored in the coal building. Once there, we provided them with warm drinks laced with laudanum, a gentle way to ensure they wouldn't suffer." The casual manner in which Thornton described the murders shocked Silverpine more than the revelation itself. These men spoke of killing 12 students as though they were discussing a routine administrative decision. "The laudanum ensured they lost consciousness peacefully," Weatherby added. "Afterwards, we used the furnace to dispose of the evidence. The extreme heat left nothing that could be identified, and we reported their disappearance as we had planned, suggesting they had become lost during the snowstorm." "But why involve me in this conversation?" Silverpine asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Because your investigation threatens to expose everything we've worked to protect," Thornton replied. "The operation generates substantial income that supports not only this college, but provides financial security for numerous families throughout Ohio. We cannot allow one man's misguided sense of justice to destroy so many lives." "What happened to my students was not justice," Silverpine said firmly. "It was murder committed to protect a criminal enterprise." "Your students died because they refused to understand the complexities of the modern world," Weatherby said, his voice taking on a threatening tone. "They could have been given positions within the operation, could have profited from their knowledge instead of threatening to destroy it. Their deaths were the result of their own stubbornness." As the conversation continued, Silverpine realized that both men fully expected him to join their operation or suffer the same fate as his students. They had not come to confess their crimes, but to recruit him or eliminate him as a threat. The casual manner in which they discussed murder convinced him that they had killed before and would not hesitate to kill again. "We're prepared to offer you a partnership in the enterprise," Thornton concluded. "Your reputation and family name would be valuable assets, and the financial rewards would ensure your security for life. The alternative is to share your students' fate." Professor Silverpine looked at the two men who had murdered 12 of his finest students and felt a clarity of purpose he had never experienced before. "I will never participate in corruption that dishonors my father's legacy and endangers innocent people," he said quietly. Professor Silverpine's response to Dean Weatherby and Registrar Thornton was to agree to consider their offer, buying himself time to implement a plan he had prepared for exactly this situation. Over the previous weeks, he had not only gathered evidence of the forgery operation, but had also documented his investigation in detailed letters addressed to federal authorities, prominent educators outside Ohio, and newspaper editors in major cities. These letters, along with copies of all the evidence he had discovered, were in the possession of a trusted colleague at Western Reserve College in Cleveland, with instructions to mail them immediately if Silverpine failed to contact him by a predetermined date. Additionally, Silverpine had shared his findings with his brother, a lawyer in Cincinnati, who had already begun preparing legal documents to present to federal prosecutors. The morning after his confrontation with Weatherby and Thornton, Silverpine traveled to Cleveland under the pretense of conducting routine college business. There, he met with federal investigators and provided them with comprehensive evidence of the forgery operation, the murder of his 12 students, and the extensive network of corruption that had placed unqualified individuals in professional positions throughout the region. The federal investigation that followed exposed one of the most extensive educational fraud operations in American history. Over the course of 6 months, investigators uncovered evidence of similar schemes operating at more than 20 institutions across 7 states, involving hundreds of fraudulent credentials and generating profits in excess of $1 million. Dean Charles Weatherby and Registrar Frederick Thornton were arrested in September 1879 and subsequently convicted of multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. Their trial revealed the full scope of their crimes, including detailed testimony about the events of February 2nd and the systematic destruction of evidence in the college's furnace. Both men were sentenced to life imprisonment, though Weatherby died in the Ohio State Penitentiary in 1883, reportedly of heart failure brought on by the stress of incarceration. Thornton served nearly 30 years before dying of natural causes in 1908, never showing remorse for his crimes or providing information about other participants in the operation. The investigation also resulted in the prosecution of corrupt officials at multiple institutions, the revocation of hundreds of fraudulent credentials, and significant reforms in how educational institutions verified and documented their graduates' qualifications. Several physicians and engineers whose credentials were revealed to be fraudulent faced criminal charges related to deaths and injuries caused by their incompetence. For Professor Marcus Silverpine, the resolution of the case brought justice for his students, but no personal satisfaction. The revelation that his own college had been used as a tool for corruption, and that his signature had been forged to legitimize fraudulent documents, devastated him personally and professionally. Although he was cleared of any wrongdoing and praised for his courage in exposing the crimes, he never fully recovered from the knowledge that 12 young lives had been lost due to corruption within his own institution. In his final report to federal investigators, Silverpine wrote, "The tragedy of February 2nd, 1879 serves as a permanent reminder that academic institutions bear a sacred responsibility to society. When we compromise our commitment to genuine education and honest credentialing, we betray not only our students, but every person who depends on the competence of professionals we certify." The 12 young men who died that night understood this responsibility better than those of us who were entrusted with their education. Silverpine College continued to operate under new administration until 1892, when declining enrollment and the permanent damage to its reputation forced its closure. The buildings were eventually purchased by the city of Ashtabula and converted into a public library, where a memorial plaque honors the 12 students who died trying to expose the corruption that had infected their institution. The forbidden files that cost 12 lives serve as a sobering reminder of how the pursuit of profit when combined with institutional authority, can corrupt even the most respected establishments and lead to consequences that extend far beyond the immediate victims. This case demonstrates that corruption in education affects not just individual careers, but public safety and the fundamental trust society places in professional competence. The courage of 12 students who risked everything to expose the truth, and the determination of one professor who refused to be silenced, ultimately prevented countless additional deaths and restored integrity to educational institutions throughout the region. What do you think about this story? Could such extensive corruption exist today without detection? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts. If you found this historical mystery compelling, subscribe to Dark Heritage Files, activate the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates true stories of courage and corruption. Until next time, remember that the past holds lessons we ignore at our own peril.